I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker today. I've known Secretary Pete for about 15 years, back when he was Mayor Pete, and actually just before that, we just called him Pete. In that time, in the past 15 years, he served in Afghanistan, gotten married, had 2 beautiful children, transformed a small city, run for president, and now serves as one of the most prominent members of President Biden's cabinet. And over the years, I've gotten to spend time with Pete, both in professional and personal settings alike. And sometimes I'm left wondering whether he's actually human. One minute, he's rushing home to put down the kids. The next minute, he's making seismic decisions about the future of America's transportation infrastructure. And then, literally 2 minutes later, he's finishing some laundry with Chasten, or wrestling with the baby monitor, or rummaging up some dinner. Somehow, he squeezes in the time to read many of the books and reports that people in this room write. And that really is who Pete is. He is grounded, caring, curious, and focused. And most importantly for our conversation today, he sweats the policy details because he knows that those details can fundamentally change the trajectory of people's lives. And man, is this an auspicious moment for the Secretary of Transportation. His service in government comes at an extremely formative time. The team at Transportation and he are hard at work implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law. And in case you weren't tracking at home, that single piece of legislation includes the largest investment in roads since Eisenhower, the largest investment in American ports in all of American history, and the largest investment in rail since the creation of Amtrak. There are more than 32,000 new infrastructure projects underway in every state across this country. Pete understands that as we build the infrastructure of tomorrow, we have to center resilience and sustainability, paving the way toward a greener future. And he's also clear-eyed that the bold new consensus that we are here to talk about today requires rebalancing power in American political economy and centering the working class in the promise of that more resilient future. So we are very grateful that in the middle of a very important and busy period, he's decided to join us here today. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the kind reception and thanks, Chris, for the kind introduction that motivates me to be the person that you just introduced and try to live up to that. And most importantly, thanks for your leadership and the great work that the Economic Security Project has been doing to make sure that the ambitions of our policy world actually live up to the scale of the problems in front of us and the potential in front of us. I think this is a really timely gathering because so much has happened in the last not quite 3 years since the administration arrived that we need to pause and take stock of the profound change that we've experienced and the extraordinary work that's been achieved so that we can also gather our thoughts and gather our energies for what needs to come next. And if it's about 3 years since our administration arrived, I know it's about 4 years since you came together to lay out a bold agenda, which I am pleased to observe is now very much reflected in so many ways, in so much of the work that is now underway in DC and around the country. It's also worth noting just how much has changed just in those 4 years since 2019. And look, some of those changes are bleak and terrifying. COVID, an insurrection, Ukraine, inflation, a dreadful and cruel end to the relative quiet that was believed not long ago to be prevailing in the Middle East. Court decisions calling into question whether the steady expansion of rights and freedoms that has characterized most of American history would meet its high watermark in our lifetime before being reversed. Meanwhile, so many dramatic changes for the better have taken place, not just in the work that's been done to confront so many of those immediate challenges that were hurled at our country, but also in work that's going to serve us well for decades. Taken together, I believe that that is very much vindicating the premise that big and bold economic thinking was and is required in order to meet the moment. I would argue that the debate between whether to be bold or whether to be pragmatic has been settled in much the same way that it was settled in the 1930s and 1940s, which is that events demonstrated that the only pragmatic approach is to be bold. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. Progressive thinking has long been characterized as idealistic, and in some ways I'll admit that it is. But I would also say that what argues most for the bold policy prescriptions that I know so many people in this community of thought have helped to shape, and things that our administration is now working to deliver, is that they are in fact the clearest and most sober response available to us in the face of our reality. In other words, not only our ideals, but our realities. The dictates of realism and pragmatism and common sense have compelled us to be bold. And while there may be no consensus on Capitol Hill around the wisdom of these policies, I think the use of the term consensus for this conference theme of a bold new consensus is fitting too, not just in terms of the left or any political party, but for an American people, which is much more supportive of our policy solutions than most of the commentary or most congressional debates would leave you thinking. It's true with regard to healthcare, where President Biden acted to cut the cost of insulin from $400 to $35 a month for seniors, made hearing aids available over the counters, negotiating drug prices for Medicare. It's true with regard to climate and clean energy. It is true in terms of tax fairness. It is true with regard to our embrace of the labor movement and workers, most recently demonstrated by the first sitting president ever to join a picket line in a strike. And most importantly, that the outcome of that is that the UAW has now reached historic tentative agreements with the big three. It's true in the way we updated the rules around wages and benefits on federal projects, so upwards of 1 million construction workers are getting much-deserved raises. It's true with junk credit card fees and non-compete contracts, where the president is using the power of government to give economic power back to people. But what's so striking to me is that not that long ago, each of these steps, at least ever since the onset of the so-called Washington Consensus, would have been considered impossible. And yet each of these specific policies also has resounding support from the American people. That's the context that we're gathering in today. In its proportions, as well as in its ambition, this agenda is a big deal. Such a big deal that I'm making the case that it ought to be known as the big deal. We had the fair deal, we had the square deal. Obviously, so much of our work takes place in the shadow of the New Deal. I would like to think that the next generation of historians will look to the Biden era's embrace of big moves, big ideas, big actions, and obviously big investments as the big deal, because it's a big deal. So what I like to call the big deal encompasses investments in everything from a broadband internet deployment that calls to mind the rural electrification of the Tennessee Valley Authority, to an American Climate Corps that echoes the WPA, and a pro-consumer, pro-family, pro-worker regulatory agenda to match. But obviously the dimensions of the big deal that I'm most qualified and most excited to talk a little bit about while we're together are those that have to do with transportation. Every time I'm asked what Bidenomics actually means, I think of it at its core as the opposite of trickle-down. And nowhere is there more literal concreteness and shape to the idea of building an economy from the ground up than in the form of transportation infrastructure. After decades of disinvestment and deregulation, we've entered a new infrastructure decade that'll represent, I think, a big part of the answer to the question of what this bold new consensus can deliver. And I want to use my time up here just to give a short accounting of what that looks like in practice. Our fundamental priorities in transportation are straightforward: to make transportation safer, to use transportation to support economic growth that lifts everyone up, to make sure transportation develops in an equitable fashion, to make sure transportation is part of the solution to climate change, and fifth, to make sure innovation in the field of transportation unfolds in ways that are good for those other 4 priorities of safety, growth, equity, and climate. So I'll briefly touch on what we've done in each of those areas, especially the economic pillar, and how the infrastructure package is helping us deliver on those goals, again with a regulatory agenda to match. First, safety. After years of increasing, roadway deaths have now declined for 5 straight quarters, but we are still losing around 40,000 people a year. That's on par with gun violence, but gets dramatically less attention. And like gun violence, it is not the same across countries. And the US is performing frighteningly worse with regard to road safety than so many of our peers in the developed world. So we have a roadway safety strategy that we are investing in with concrete resources that is about safer vehicles, safer streets, safer speeds, safer people, and a safer and better standard of post-crash care. And as an agency that has seen once bold ideas become a matter of consensus, at least since the battles over seatbelt policies in the 1970s and 80s, this is a clear example where we have a life-saving mission and a lot more opportunity to do what's needed. Our department is advancing new rules that would require automatic emergency braking systems on new passenger cars, light trucks, and heavy vehicles, which would prevent tens of thousands of injuries and save hundreds of lives every year. We've awarded around $900 million through a first-of-its-kind program called Safe Streets and Roads for All to directly help cities and towns and tribes to design and build roads that reduce crashes. Projects that are already benefiting hundreds of communities. And of course, we're looking beyond roadway safety to railway and aviation safety. I have to note, as we draw closer to the 1-year anniversary of the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, we are urgently calling for passage of the Railway Safety Act in Congress and challenging any member who was quick to speak out at that time to make clear in this time whether they will side with us or with industry lobbyists when it comes to that reform package. And we're taking a range of actions to maintain the extraordinary safety record of aviation in this country, which is a living example of how the right kind of regulations can save countless lives. That's safety. On climate, climate change is threatening transportation, and carbon pollution from transportation is worsening climate change. It's a sector that contributes more to pollution than any other part of our economy, so it should aspire to be the biggest part of the solution to carbon pollution, and we're acting in every mode to do that. Major investments in transit, the largest in federal history, premised on the idea that you shouldn't have to bring 2,000 pounds of metal with you everywhere you go. We recently made $35 billion in loans available for transit-oriented development, recognizing that for low-income people, transportation and housing aren't separate things. They're very much part of the same family budget. We're helping to make cleaner and greener transportation options available, from bus rapid transit to active transportation, of course making EVs more affordable and building out that nationwide network of EV chargers. And importantly, as we pursue this, we are breaking the old false choice of climate versus jobs by creating a new generation of climate jobs in fields ranging from smart grid development to EV battery manufacturing. Then, equity. The infrastructure package is so wide-ranging and so great in its proportions that if we actually successfully make sure everyone shares in its benefits, this era will be remembered for wealth gaps beginning to close. It's an example where we have to not simply emulate waves of past public investment, which got the proportions right, but often with a tragically inequitable distribution, but rather do better, and we are doing better, both in terms of where the improvements go and in terms of who gets to participate. That means making sure small and minority-owned businesses have fair chances to compete for infrastructure contracts, and we have boosted and exceeded our goal for federal contracts going to SDBs. And of course, it really matters where infrastructure goes and who it serves. An honest, progressive accounting of past investment will see this as an example of where the question of big versus small government is not enough to answer whether we had good and fair government. Federal spending did a lot of damage in this regard, even while it was doing a lot of good, as so many neighborhoods, often black neighborhoods, were divided or destroyed to make room for highways. And it so often happened at the expense of people who didn't have the power or the means to resist or reshape those plans. So, we've launched the first ever program to reconnect communities divided by past infrastructure decisions. The billions already available. I was up in Buffalo not long ago with activists who were moved almost to tears as they described having worked since the 1980s to do something about the way the Kensington Expressway divided the city from one neighborhood to the other, basically cut off the principally black neighborhood on the east side where most of the jobs were. So we're decking over it, basically building a roof over the highway that's going to make nobody worse off and a lot of people better off. Just one example of the work that we're doing around the country on that. And when it comes to innovation and transformation, I think the 2020s are going to be remembered as a period of the swiftest advancement in transportation technology since the jet age, so we have to work to shape them to make sure that they benefit people in real ways. And I'll be very interested to see, among other things, the insights around AI that emerge from this conference. And then on economic opportunity. And I want to linger here and talk about three of the economic components of our work. First, jobs. Creating jobs with good wages, with a chance to join a union for people with or without a college degree. And creating jobs for people who come from the same places where we're building the projects. Again, there are examples of this across the country. I'll give you one called Hire LAX, where I met a program pursuant to a project labor agreement that insists on hiring people from the same zip code as the airport, which is a disadvantaged zip code, to get a chance to get into the union pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship training that then got them these incredible jobs that they were so proud of when I sat down with the workers who were getting a shot at that. We're seeing some states step up and use the eligibilities that we've had all along, but not everybody has acted on, to take things like federal aid highway construction formula dollars and use them for things like workforce development and workforce support, including what I saw in Pittsburgh, where they built a child care facility on the site of the airport terminal construction project, which meant that more working parents, in particular a lot of working mothers, had a chance to get those good-paying jobs. And we know that these opportunities can create and change the future for a family. There's a bit of napkin math that I don't usually trot out in public, but I think I'm with a just nerdy enough fellow audience to be interested in this. So if someone was working on the interstate highway system in 1967, they could be expected to make wages that would amount to about $60,000 a year in today's dollars. Over the course of a 5-year construction project, they would have made enough to put a down payment on a house, which would on average then be worth about $400,000 today. Plus, if they put 5% of their income into retirement savings back then, that'd be worth over $350,000 now. And that collectively would put their household wealth about 6 times the median for that family or for that one worker's descendants one generation in. That home ownership, that ability to educate your kids would all spring from one good job. And it follows, of course, that if we multiply that out across all of the jobs being created on the 32,000 and counting transportation infrastructure projects we're building, it will change the trajectory of a generation. In places like New York, we're going to be making some big announcements with a lot of commas and a lot of zeros in them in the next couple of days, but also in places like Grand Forks, North Dakota, where they've been trying to get rid of a railroad crossing that was dangerous for 30 years, but didn't have the funding to do it with. Or Chamberlain, South Dakota, where their general aviation terminal at their airport, which is important for medevac missions, is a mobile home. And with a 6-figure grant, we were able to help them turn it into an actual building. All of these things stack up to a better future and to better supply chains, which is why we're shoring them up and shoring them a little closer to home. We know that so many of the jobs that are affected by supply chains, including, by the way, the manufacturing jobs undergoing a renaissance under President Biden, depend on us making those physical infrastructure improvements. And when we do, it's actually part of the fight against inflation, because we know that shipping costs are a big part of what contributed to that. So there's the direct jobs. Then there's the access to jobs that come from the projects once they're completed. Because, of course, transportation is the difference between getting a new job or not, or keeping a job or not. That's why we're making the biggest investment in passenger rail since Amtrak was created, biggest investment in transit ever, faster, more reliable rail for more and more people. For example, Saturday, I'll be in East Harlem with some really big and really long-awaited news about extending the 2nd Avenue subway up to 125th Street. These projects matter, and we're really excited about it. And then third, competition and anti-monopoly policy, because as we rebuild the physical infrastructure that's been eroded by the weight of tires and the passage of time, we're also working to restore a competitive landscape that was corroded by decades of permissive and deregulatory policy. Some examples include the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, giving American companies leverage against shipping cartels, which again, I think is a big part of the fight against inflation. The work we're doing on EV chargers, where we put universal standards in place to ensure that the charging network can't be made of walled gardens, but is interoperable between different charging companies so that no firm can unfairly exploit its size or position. Taking action on trucking to improve wages and working conditions for drivers and to make sure that new truckers and owner-operators aren't put at an unfair disadvantage or trapped in a predatory leasing arrangement. Because the truth is, no matter how good we are at recruiting new people to become truck drivers, we will be filling a leaky bucket if we don't shore up the quality of the job and the compensation that goes with it. And then there's aviation consumer protection and competition. Last year, hardly any of the 10 major airlines had any enforceable commitments around things like free rebooking or hotels or meal vouchers when they got a passenger stuck. Now, just about all of them do because of enforceable commitments that we secured. And we're working on a new rule to ban junk fees for good on things like sitting next to your kids and to secure new forms of compensation for extreme delays. We're excited about it. And wherever the circumstances meet our responsibilities and our authorities, we're going to act to make sure a more competitive aviation sector emerges. And since the law gives us particular responsibilities on aviation, we're going to pay particular attention to aviation. And that has meant picking up tools that have long lay dormant in our department but are absolutely within our mandate. It's a change in approach. I would argue it's a good change in approach because the times call for us to make sure we're doing what both the law and the moment require of us. So I'm proud of the work that we're doing and the thought that has gone into it, and I'm excited about the potential ahead for more good policy work. But I also want to emphasize, even as we're leaning in, thinking about what we can do next, it's going to take a lot to secure what we have achieved. There are active efforts right now, most notably in the House of Representatives, to slow or weaken or reverse or dismantle a lot of this work, even wildly popular elements of it, like infrastructure development, which House Republicans have repeatedly voted to cut and might do so as early as today. Even as issues from supply chain delays to air traffic control staffing constraints have demonstrated that this would be a terrible time to cut resources going into our infrastructure. We've got a Speaker of the House who is a new figure with old thinking. Seems to favor the economic strategies of the 1980s and the social policies of, I guess, the 1950s. Never mind that these policies and strategies have been discredited. Again, our commitment to our approach isn't just rooted in idealism, but in experience, right? In outcomes, in data. In fact, when I think about the hard lessons learned from failures in the 1980s style of supply-side economics, from the practical failing of trickle-down policies to the empirical collapse of the Laffer curve, ironically, they have proven to bear out the exact same critique that was heard in a previous generation's dorm rooms talking about the left, which was, of course, that it sounds good in theory but didn't work in practice. The jury is in, and our way works better. So we can't go back. We have to keep advancing our good policy work, consolidate our achievements with the courage of our convictions, and, of course, the humility to adjust what we need to based on what we learn. That's our approach, that's our style, that's our focus, and it compels us to keep thinking big. We're taking care of the basics, which itself can be a bold thing to do if you do it in the right way and at the right scale, and that is the premise of the big deal. So I hope you can see elements of the future of a stronger and fairer country that we're making real that involves bringing costs down, wages up, and improving the literal and legal foundations on which people live and work. It's not easy, it's not quick, just as we are currently physically working on what I sometimes call the cathedrals of our infrastructure. The totality of our work is like a cathedral, whose cornerstones might be laid by different hands belonging to a different generation than the hands that will lay its keystones. But we are very much underway, and I would argue we already have a great deal to show for it. So I hope we can remain thoughtful, smart, serious, united in purpose, even if not aligned on every detail, and above all, bold, because it is the common sense thing to do. That kind of boldness need not be divisive. In fact, it works so well in practice that I believe it is destined to be the stuff of consensus. Thank you again for the chance to join today, and thanks for everything that you're doing out there.